We are now live. Okay. So, hi guys, welcome to What Your Doctor Never Told You About Birth Control. So, who am I and why are we talking about birth control? Why should you listen to me at all? My name is Michelle, and my background is I'm a scientist by training. So, my undergrad is in biology. I went and got a master's in nutrition, and ever since then, I've been in personalized nutrition biotechnology, where I'm now the director of science at Inside Tracker, which is a personalized wellness platform. And if you're here or watching this, it's probably because you either know me in person or found me yelling about reproductive health on the internet. Because even though I was so privileged to have two science degrees, I left feeling absolutely clueless about my own fertility. I knew nothing and had to spend the last 4 or 5 years really digging out all this information for myself. I'm also assuming that if you are like me, the current stats and the way you see normal people go through this process of reproductive health and being on birth control and coming off of it and approaching fertility, like you don't want those stats. We realize that the normal method is not working. And there's so much we can do for ourselves to make it a much better experience. And a huge, huge part of that is early education and being really proactive. So I'm really happy you're here, and I hope this is going to be a very, very empowering experience for all of you. So what we're going to be going through today, it is all about birth control, as I know you know. We're going to do a quick sex ed recap because I always like to say, if you were lucky enough to get sex ed, it still probably sucked. We're going to go over how birth control actually works. We'll talk about the effects of birth control use on our body, what you can do while you're on birth control to minimize the effects, and then post-birth control, fertility recovery, and natural birth control options. Because a lot of people are asking, what are my options if I'm not interested in using hormonal contraceptives anymore? Quick disclaimer, it's not a replacement for medical advice. And the method I'm introducing you today, which is a form of natural birth control, it's a very, very high level introduction to it, but it's not the method itself because the method itself does have rules that must be followed in order to get to that very high confidence and high efficacy, right? So it's not the method itself, but it is an introduction to the method. So it's always important for me to say. So quick menstrual cycle review. I always like to remind everybody that we say menstrual cycle, but what it really should be called is ovulatory cycle, right? Because ovulation is a star. The whole reason we have a period and we go through this whole hormonal cascade every month is to trigger ovulation. So this, of course, is in a hormonal contraceptive free cycle, but it's really good to understand the foundation of what's happening because it teaches you how birth control is even working, but then it teaches you what you can expect to come off of it. So these are the things that we want to be supporting. And then it also helps you understand if you're using a fertility awareness method of birth control, knowing the background of the biology is how the method works. So it's important for everybody. And the way we can think about the menstrual cycle is divided into two phases. So we have before ovulation and after ovulation. Pre-ovulatory, this is the follicular phase. This is from day one of your period to the day of ovulation. The length of this can vary. So if you're someone who has a longer cycle, so a healthy cycle can be anywhere between 24 and 35 days. So if you're somewhere on like the 30, 32, 30 plus spectrum, what you have is just a longer pre-ovulatory phase. And if you've ever been sick or traveling or really stressed and you've noticed your period came at a different time than usual, what's being affected is this pre-ovulatory phase. The post-ovulatory phase is from right after ovulation to the day before the start of your next cycle. This is pretty fixed, right? So this is always going to be 12 to 14 days optimally from ovulation to the start of your next period. So what does that look like? It's really important to remember too that women are only fertile 5 to 6 days out of the whole cycle. Men are fertile 24/7, 365, and yet we're the ones on birth control. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense, but that's the way it is, I guess. And if you look at the breakdown, we have our post-ovulatory phase, like I said, 12 to 14 days. This is an infertile phase, always. Because if you've ovulated, the egg is the epitome of if he wanted to, he would, because it would rather disintegrate than wait any longer than 12 to 24 hours after ovulation happens. So once ovulation happens, it's a 1 day event. right? So everything after this, up until your next period, there's no egg, there's no possibility of pregnancy. This is an infertile phase. The 5 to 6 day fertile window. Why is the fertile window 5 or 6 days if ovulation is a 1 day event? Well, it's because of cervical mucus. So cervical mucus is the gooey, creamy stuff that you start to see around, the midpoint of your cycle. And we've been conditioned to think this is just discharge that we can ignore, but this is actually fertile cervical mucus, right? That's what the goopy stuff is. And there's ways that we can classify it once we learn to actually understand what we're seeing that help us understand how close are we to ovulation occurring. So cervical mucus at all, if you see it, is a sign of pending ovulation. And how the biology of that works is because when we produce cervical mucus, it means our estrogen is rising. It means your cervix is opening. And what it does is it allows sperm to survive. Normally, our vaginal pH is way too acidic for them. But once we have cervical mucus in the mix, they can survive up to 5 days in that. And then the cervix, which is right here, has these little sperm hotels where if you have sex during your fertile window and the cervical mucus is there so they can survive, they can chill in the sperm hotels within the cervix and await ovulation to potentially fertilize an egg. This is why if you have sex like 4 days before ovulation and then never again for the rest of the cycle, you still could potentially get pregnant because your cervical mucus was keeping the sperm alive in anticipation of ovulation. So that's why we have a 5 to 6 day fertile window, even though ovulation is a one-time event. In our pre-ovulatory phase, I know it sounds kind of confusing, relatively infertile. Relatively infertile, what does that mean? Well, that means that these days are guilty until proven innocent, right? We never know exactly when the fertile window will open. So this, if there ever is like a risk to be taken, if you're using your own cycle for birth control, it would be, because you didn't catch cervical mucus or you didn't notice that fertile sign, your fertile window opened and you might have missed it, you didn't notice, but this would be a fertile sign. And if you do have unprotected sex that day and you thought you were in your pre-ovulatory phase still, that's where the unintentional pregnancy can happen. So this is why we want to be really careful with the pre-ovulatory phase. It's technically not fertile until this 5 to 6 day window opens. But what's really important to understand is that, we never have the same cycle every time. So we really want to hold on to that these biologically are potentially fertile until proven otherwise. So to give you a really good idea, because I know people throw up the menstrual cycle graph and you see all these like crazy lines, and it's really easy to gloss over. But I don't want to do that. I want to really set the foundation for you that this is all happening together. It's not like 17 things to remember. They all actually line up really nicely and inform each other. So the follicular phase you can remember because this is the phase that follicles are developing. So when you're starting your period, you have a new group of eggs forming in your ovary, right? These are like a little cohort of eggs that are eventually trying to ovulate that cycle. However, only one wins, right? So when these follicles are developing in the ovary, this is your ovary, and those follicles are actually producing estrogen. So as they grow, that's why this estrogen increases. When the estrogen levels hit a peak, that is the triggering event for an LH surge. And the LH surge is the triggering event for ovulation. So LH is if you've ever heard of people using those ovulation predictor kits, those LH strips. It's a secondary fertile sign because you can have an LH surge without ovulating, right? You can only ovulate once, but technically you could have multiple LH surges if your body is trying to ovulate. So this is really common if someone has long cycles or has PCOS and the body's trying to hit ovulation, get to that certain threshold. And so if you're just using the LH strip and it's reading positive, it confuses a lot of people, right? Because it doesn't always mean that you're about to ovulate in the next 24 to 36 hours. It just predicts it. So that's why I don't hate LH strips. I think that they're fine, but they're a secondary sign to your cervical mucus, like we just talked about. And the other primary fertile sign that we will talk about is your body temperature. So I like to just throw that in there because everyone likes to just go straight to the OPK. They're great additional data, but I would never just rely on them for that very reason. So LH surges and triggers ovulation. The LH surge can happen more than once, but pop quiz, how many times can ovulation happen? You can put it in the chat. Just to guess. And it's okay if if you guys don't want to, because it is kind of a trick question, because we can only ovulate one time, right? The dominant follicle, so even though there's a group developing here, the dominant follicle is what breaks free from the ovary and moves into the fallopian tube. That is the event of ovulation itself. So now we are out of the follicular phase. Then we move into the luteal phase. So ovulation just happened. The egg is now outside the ovary and into the fallopian tube. But the structure that the egg left behind in the ovary is called the corpus luteum. So luteal, corpus luteum, that's where that comes from. And that's the thing that's making progesterone. So it's pretty wild. Your ovary, the developing follicles, were making the estrogen. And then the thing that gets left behind is making the progesterone. So these two major sex hormones aren't coming from anywhere else in your body besides your ovaries, which is pretty crazy. The progesterone, what it's going to do is raise your basal body temperature and dry up that cervical mucus. So we have this big rising level of progesterone in the luteal phase. And this is why if you are using basal body temperature as a fertile sign, you will see your temperature increase and sustain. If fertilization does not occur, so if there's no sperm chilling in the hotel or you didn't have unprotected sex on your ovulation day, then fertilization doesn't happen, the progesterone levels decrease, and then eventually at the end of the 12 to 14 days, your uterine lining sheds, aka your period, right? The reason that the luteal phase is always 12 to 14 days is because that's the life cycle of this guy. So that's why it's really not susceptible to any outside influence or anything that you're doing or stress levels, because it's dependent on how long this corpus luteum can produce progesterone. Now, you can have low progesterone, and there are signs to look out for in your cycle for that. It's really common. But my whole point is to say that once you understand this and you see what your body's doing, you can easily tie it back to what's happening hormonally, which is very, very cool. So what is birth control really doing? Hormonal contraceptives work in essentially three main ways. They interfere with ovulation, so that whole hormonal cascade we just talked about, there is not that to trigger it. They interfere with implantation by thinning the endometrium, so the endometrial lining being the inside of your uterus right here. For optimal conception, this should be about 10 millimeters thick. If it's any less than 7 millimeters, there's little to no chance that pregnancy can occur. What birth control will do is thin it to 2 to 5 millimeters, right? So even if you're on a method like potentially some hormonal IUDs that do allow ovulation to technically still occur, the uterine lining will be so thin that there's no way that a fertilized egg could ever actually implant and you could eventually conceive. They also prevent your cervix from producing that fertile cervical mucus. So instead of, having the increasing amount of cervical mucus that you would see pending ovulation, what it's going to be is perpetually in this, it forms a mucus plug when you get into this infertile phase. And that's what birth control is replicating, right? It's plugging up the cervix so that no fertile cervical mucus can come through and sperm cannot enter the cervix if it's there. So this is what we're used to seeing in a natural cycle, right? Pretty familiar with the fluctuating hormones and how this is all happening in a really nice pattern. And then this is what it actually looks like if this is actually the pill. So this cracked me up the first time I saw it because I don't know what I expected, but it wasn't this. This is you essentially taking the dosage of the synthetic estrogen and progesterone each day, and then hitting the 21 days and doing the placebo week. So we go on birth control because we're told it'll regulate our cycle and fix our symptoms. It'll balance our hormones. And that's the only way we can truly avoid pregnancy, right? But looking at this graph, it's quite clear it's not balancing anything. I mean, this is kind of an override. This is a complete rewriting of that hormonal script that we just looked at to something that is akin to just silencing that pattern entirely. And it's important for me to call this out because I think we're all comfortable with the fact by now that the bleed you have while you're on hormonal contraceptives, so namely the pill, is not a true period, right? I think we're all pretty aware that that's a withdrawal bleed. Your body's used to getting this dosage of hormones. All of a sudden they go away, and then your body will shed whatever uterine lining had built up in the absence of those hormones. But I don't think I ever realized how manipulative the birth control pack design really was, because there's no medical reason for a 28-day pill pack. I remember I was on the pill for 6 years, and there would be times where I was like, I have a vacation or an event coming up, and I kind of want to just keep taking the pill so I don't have to go through the, bleed week. And I was a little worried about it because I didn't want anything to like mess up. So I don't want to mess up anything with my period. It's just so funny because there's nothing to mess up. Like you could keep taking the birth control pill. They could have made it a 60-day pill pack. They could have made it a 120-day pill pack. They could have made you have a yearly bleed, right? It's truly just designed to make you feel more at ease, this 28 days. So again, not that it's anything wrong. This is just what you would be doing continuously if you were to keep taking it. But I mean, the marketing of it cuts pretty deep, if you ask me. It's also important to understand that not all hormonal contraceptives work the same way out of those three functions. They don't all prevent ovulations. So like I mentioned, sometimes you can ovulate sometimes on the low dose hormonal IUDs. Now, that does mainly depend on how long you've had them for. But I think a common misconception is that if you are still ovulating with a hormonal contraceptive, you have some semblance of a healthy trackable cycle. And unfortunately, because of these functions, like the cervical mucus influence and the uterine lining influence, those are hormonally dependent too. So we know that that's not ultimately true. The only one that doesn't do this, I mean, the copper IUD is non-hormonal, but just to put up the comparison, what that's doing is making copper is toxic to sperm. So that's that function, but everything else uses one of, if not all, of these three ways of preventing pregnancy. So for the effects of birth control, not side effects, because I think side effect in general is a stupid term because, whenever you introduce a biologic into your system, the effects it has are the effects it has. And we just call something a side effect if it's not the thing that we want to talk about, right? But we have hormone receptors and, receptors all over our body. And to think that just something is a side effect because it's not doing the thing we intended is a bit misleading. Right. So the effects of birth control on our body, this is quite dense, but bear with me. This is informed consent. This is the information that we should have been given, day dot when we got the birth control pill or a hormonal contraceptive prescription, whatever it was. This isn't to scare you. This is simply to inform you. I would never throw all this information at you without a solution. And the solution is not just come off birth control, just so we're aware. But for the effects, in the research, because if you want any of these studies, feel free. And I do have them all. I just didn't put them all on the slide because there's quite a bit. But when we talk about the potential effects, we do have an increased risk of thrombosis, which is the blood clots that can obscure blood flow. And on birth control, it's anywhere from 4 to 7 times your normal risk. So what it would be if you were not on birth control. The risk of vulvar pain is significantly higher, and that risk is amplified if you started HCs. HC stands for hormonal contraceptive here, before the age of 16. And that's likely due to the decrease in thickness of the labia minora, so it does shrink like vaginal lips, and reduction in diameter of the vaginal opening. So if you have painful sex while you're on any hormonal contraceptive, this could be why, right? Clitoral volume was found to decrease by 20% on average. When I found out the clit shrunk, I was like, holy moly, like, could you imagine if men got put on a contraceptive that shrunk the penis by 20%? Like, that would never happen. They also shrink the ovaries by about 50% compared to non-users, but that is temporary. So if you discontinue birth control, they will return to baseline. They have been shown to return to baseline. They would never happen. The hormonal contraceptives increase the risk of breast cancer and liver cancer. So even if you may have seen studies that the birth control pill or hormonal contraceptives can decrease risk for certain cancers, namely endometrial, ovarian, and colorectal, unfortunately, taking all the evidence into consideration and putting it together, the net effect is still positive. Positive meaning there is an increased risk with hormonal contraceptives, because they increase the risk of certain cancers more than they reduce the effect of others. And the International Agency for Research on Cancer has the combined oral contraceptive pill. This is one that most of us take. labeled as a group 1 carcinogen due to its link with cervical, breast, and liver cancer. Also on the body, what they do is they do put you at an increased risk for nutritional deficiencies, namely B vitamins, zinc, selenium, phosphorus, magnesium, and CoQ10. Your need for other micronutrients like vitamins C, A, and E do increase significantly while on hormonal contraceptives because your body will be metabolizing them differently. They've been shown to lower libido and dramatically decrease testosterone levels. And then the Depo-Provera shot is actually currently used to chemically castrate sex offenders, which is pretty crazy. And I'm not going to act like it's the same dosage because it's not, right? Obviously, in that case, it's a higher dosage at a more frequent rate than you would get the Depo shot for birth control. But my point here is that the way that birth control is designed, it's designed to work, right? It's designed to override and silence the reproductive system in a way that it does what it's designed to do, prevent pregnancy, and it does it very well. What it's not designed to do is keep your body and your reproductive system and your fertility preserved and functioning optimally while you're on it, right? So it's really good to be aware of this because there are things we can do while we're on it and while we're coming off of it to try to mitigate the damage. I also want to zoom in a bit on the brain because I feel like we hear the laundry list of side effects and it's like, can make you anxious, can make you depressed. And it's like, let's paint the biological picture. I mean, we have sex hormones, hundreds of thousands of them on all the main structures of our brain. So they're programmed to do different things depending on what's available hormonally. So this is why we feel and like act a little differently in different phases of our cycle when we're cycling naturally, right? So this means that your brain, the thing that makes you you, is being programmed differently depending on the sex hormones available in your body. So it would be wild to not associate, and many doctors don't, anxiety, depressive, or mood symptoms with birth control when it's available and it's affecting brain receptors all the time. The most common reported symptoms are anxiety, depression, and feeling like you're in a haze compared to when you're not on birth control. And this is fun to point out too. I mean, in the same vein. So in 2016, there was a study where they were trying to look at the safety and efficacy of a male version of birth control, right? So it's 320 men, and I don't know how long 20 of them quit into the trial, right? They didn't last the full duration. 20 of them quit, 6 discontinued for mood changes, 6 discontinued for acne, pain at the injection site, palpitations, hypertension, and erectile dysfunction. 8 discontinued for one or more side effects, with one of them multiple reasons being mood or anxiety, depressive related. And then they canceled the entire trial, saying that the risks of the participants outweighed the potential benefits. And I just showed you all that research about the potential risks to women for hormonal contraceptives. And no committee came in and took away that trial. So this point is to say, yeah, the research exists, so we can have a little bit of comfort, and this has been looked into, but not a lot of comfort in the fact that if you were to take the same study and do it to men, they quit it entirely. So this is why being informed is so, so important, because I feel like your doctor probably didn't tell you that either. Mine sure didn't. And this is also the thing that I wanted to say. So before we get to what you can do while you're on birth control, because there are things, the answer to all of that information is not, I need to be off birth control yesterday, unless you feel that way. You're the only person that can make that decision for yourself, and to do it informed is the best possible way. And that's because you're the only one who knows your medical history, your risk tolerance, your personal preference, what big events you may or may not have coming up in your life, right? That's what you should make your decision on. I mean, if someone had told me all this at 20 when I went on the pill, I probably still would have taken it because I was that desperate to like have clear skin and no period pain. But I would have wanted to know the things I could do to try to buffer the damage. And I probably would have come off of it sooner, in full honesty. So I was on it for 6 years and then switched to an IUD for 2 years. And I've been off the IUD for 1 year. But that probably would have looked very different had I had informed consent. So what are the things you can do while on birth control? Well, the first thing we would want to do is replenish those nutrients that the hormonal contraceptives deplete. So there are a lot available on the market. Some of them are specifically designed to be companions to birth control. I am really a stickler for quality because Well, it's really important to understand where your supplements are being sourced from. Have they been third-party tested? Have they been heavy metal tested, right? Because what we don't want to do is add more toxic burden to your liver, because we'll get to that next, but that is what birth control is also doing, is taxing the liver. So that's why I work with Fullwell, because I vetted the hell out of that brand and I personally know the dietitian that's formulating these. And that's why I recommend, if you just wanted something quick to look at, this fertility booster, which is an antioxidant blend that does actually contain all of the specific micronutrients that we talked about that hormonal contraceptives deplete. What you could also do is make sure you're taking a multivitamin, or you could even do a half dose of a prenatal. And the reason for that is it's okay, yeah, you're on birth control, but the thing is that prenatals are formulated to have the reproductive health beneficial nutrients and key fertility nutrients at slightly higher doses than you might need them anyway. So the fact that if you're already at a deficit, a dosage like that would actually serve you quite well. Another thing you could do is incorporate liver. I know it's like kind of crazy to say, or a dried liver supplement if you're not into eating liver. And the reason for liver is because it's so high. Like if you want a food source and not a supplement source of these nutrients, it really ticks all the boxes for those key fertility nutrients. And it's like legions higher than you would find them in any other natural food source. So it's like the folate, the B6, the B12, the selenium, and zinc. It's a lot easier to get it that way. So, I mean, I'm not really cooking liver terribly much. I think those desiccated supplements are a really good idea. But also, I have found this ancestral blend ground beef, which does put organ meat inside of it, and it tastes just like ground beef. I don't even notice it. It is a few dollars more than your average ground beef, but you know, it's pay now, pay later in the health world. So the other thing you can do is support your liver, because your liver is the one processing all of the synthetic hormones that you're getting from contraceptions. So the way to do that is to reduce overall toxic load. So this is your beauty products, kitchenware, cleaning products, your water. And I know that's a lot. So and it takes a lot of time to cycle through everything. So I recommend people start in their kitchen and their bathroom if you're looking to slowly ease into a cleaner, endocrine disrupting, chemical free brands products, right? Because those are typically the things we use the most and have the most contact with. And then everything else can fall into place over time. Another thing you can do is focus on cruciferous vegetables. So this is our broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower family, because they're really rich in a compound called DIM, which helps metabolize estrogen really effectively. You can also supplement with DIM, but some people do prefer the food source. So I like to lead with that typically. So when we're coming off the birth control pill or any other hormonal contraceptives, what does that recovery protocol look like? Well, it looks a lot like the things that you would do while on it, right? So that's really good. Establish that habit so that you have a smoother ride out of your transition from the contraceptive pill. If you had issues like acne or period pain or irregular periods, doing things like this can help regulate your cycle and set you up for success so that you don't necessarily experience those things again. Or if you do, there's still things we can do about that. So there's always hope, right? But when you're fully off of the contraceptives, the recovery protocol looks like nutrient repletion, definitely. Supporting your liver, definitely. Also supporting your natural hormone production. So now that you're cycling naturally, we want to do things that really do get those hormones to the levels that they should be at. Because like people throw around hormone balance all the time. What does hormone balance even mean? It means that your hormones are hitting the right level at the right time when they're supposed to. So they're coming up to the right level and they're going back down in the way that it's expected. So that's really all it means. How we do this is nutrition, absolutely. So iodine, I called this one out because the thyroid is so important. Our thyroid is a master regulator and very, very tied to our fertility. So we want to make sure we're getting enough iodine. It's going to be in mainly foods like seaweed, but also fish and shellfish are incredible fertility foods. Sleep is the fastest, easiest, cheapest way to achieve a healthy hormone profile. So this looks like 7 to 10 hours most nights, complete darkness, no blue light, 30 to 60 minutes before bed. And also from a dietary perspective, eating healthy fat, right? Which we were like so scared out of fat when we were, I mean, all of us were, but unfortunately, nutrition did us a big disservice because that was unfortunately based off of a lot of erroneous data. And we know that we need an intake of healthy dietary fat to maintain healthy hormones because we build hormones from fat. The precursor to hormones can really only be made from the things that you get from fat, so namely cholesterol, right? So we want to make sure we're getting enough olive oil, avocado, full fat dairy, because in studies, they looked at full fat dairy versus like skim or low fat dairy and found better fertility and pregnancy outcomes when people ate full fat dairy, which is surprising because we've been scared off that too. And nuts and seeds are amazing and really easy to pretty much add into what you're already eating. The other area of health we want to focus on when coming off of birth control is gut health. So everything above will help with gut health, but to target it specifically, fermented foods and beverages are going to be really amazing. Bone broth and collagen because they contain a high level of glutamine, which is really nourishing to your intestinal lining. And then also fiber. So whole grain breads, vegetables. And the reason is because fiber is the preferred food source for your microbes in your gut. So when you eat fiber, they eat fiber, and then they create a lot of really healthy compounds that are associated with better diversity and abundance of good bacteria in the gut. Things that I really want people to know, right? So when we're coming off the contraceptive, it could any type, right? So we're coming off contraceptives, there's a period of subfertility. So what that means is if you're someone who believes that you can come off contraceptives and immediately start trying, it's really important to be aware of there is this period of time where it takes fertility to return to normal levels. So in a perfectly healthy couple, like the average time it takes to conceive is 4 months because you really only have a 20 to 25% chance of conception every cycle, even if the two of you are perfectly healthy, right? You're doing all the right things. So that's already 4 months. When we add in coming off of contraceptives, we add time on. So if you're coming off the pill, it's now 6 months instead of 4. If you're coming off the hormonal IUD, these are on average, by the way, based on studies. So on average, it takes 8 months to conceive. The pill, so that was progestin only, combined pill, you're up to 8 months. The implant, 10 months, and the shot, so the depot shot is actually the longest, with 15 to 18 months, this period of subfertility. And if you think back to the biology, that it could be used as a form of chemical castration, this kind of makes sense. You know, we have a lot we need to do to get that stuff back online. So if you are planning to come off birth control to try to conceive, my recommendation, I know it sounds like a lot, come off of it at least 18 months to 2 years before you plan to try. This will make sure you have enough nutrient repletion, right? Because if you're nutrient deficient, your baby will be nutrient deficient. Proper hormone function to make sure you're ovulating well, you have that perfect like 12 to 14 day luteal phase to sustain a healthy pregnancy, and a cycle that's optimized for conception. So we want to make sure that you've got your healthy cervical mucus coming through. We want to make sure you have that nice temperature rise. We want to make sure everything looks the way it should. And I have included the parameters of an optimal menstrual cycle for you to refer to. Because a lot of the time, you know, we think if we get pregnant, we can rely on a prenatal or a healthy diet. But I always like to remind people too, like I've never had kids, but I see this a lot where you get into the first trimester and you are so deathly sick that you cannot eat a thing and like let alone swallow a prenatal, let alone eat healthy food, right? So what your body's going to do in that case is rely on your nutrient stores. If you're fresh off contraception, you're likely not going to have those nutrient stores. You're likely going to be depleted. So giving yourself time to build those up so that even worst case scenario, you really can't stomach anything healthy for that first trimester, you've got a good warehouse full of these really good critical fertility nutrients for both you and your developing baby. Another thing, I just want to yell this to the world, hold off on fertility testing for a bit. And I see doctors testing people with fertility panels on birth control, and that's crazy because think about everything we just said, right? It's it's shutting them down. It's temporarily, you know, ceasing activity. And if your hormone, like your ovary has shrunk and it's not producing the hormones it is, why would you test the things that are supposed to come out of them, right? But they do, and then women get so scared that they have low AMH and poor fertility. And it's this whole psychological mess that they're doing because doctors were not told this stuff, right? So the most common one I see is AMH. There's a few other fertility labs that we could talk about. But what I would love everyone to know about AMH, it's anti-Müllerian hormone, and it's a protein produced by your ovarian follicles when eggs are developing. And essentially, the more eggs you have, the higher your AMH is. It's like how many eggs are in the bank. AMH can change, right? The eggs in the bank is how many eggs are in the bank at that given cycle. AMH can go up, AMH can go down. If you're vitamin D deficient, it can drive your AMH levels down, right? If you start supplementing with vitamin D, your AMH can climb back up. A lot of lifestyle things tie into AMH levels. But what is not useful in, it doesn't tell you about the oocyte, so the egg or the embryo quality, nor does it predict pregnancy. I mean, there is no correlation between AMH levels and likelihood of conceiving. So already it's kind of a fallacy. AMH is supposed to be only really useful if you're going through an assisted reproductive technology like egg freezing or IVF. They would want to know your AMH level to understand, is this going to be a good cycle to harvest your eggs, right? That's really the value of AMH. And the way we've been using it in modern society, it's just getting lost a bit, the translation of it. But what's really good to know is if you're on birth control or coming off birth control, do not run and get a fertility panel because the birth control will have lowered your AMH level temporarily. So here you can see if you're on the pill, it can lower it up to 24%. Progestin only pill up to 15%. The vaginal ring is 22% lower. Hormonal IUD by 6.7. The implant can lower AMH by 23%. The copper IUD 1.6. So copper is non-hormonal, but here we see it does have a slight negative effect. It's only a temporary drop, so don't stress. They do return to baseline, but wait at least 6 months before getting these tested because you need everything to restore and go back to normal before you really get an understanding of what that picture of your fertility is like. So how can we confidently prevent pregnancy naturally? So the method that I'll be exposing you guys to today is called fertility awareness. And all it is using your own fertile signs to answer the question every single day with certainty, am I fertile today? Yes or no? That's all it is. What it's not, and when you say fertility awareness, this is what people think of. So I really like to specify this is not the rhythm method. This in no way is relying on past cycles or your present one to predict the current or future one, right? We stay present, we stay very scientific, and we understand how to read our fertile signs to say, am I fertile today? Yes or no. That's all it is. There are many fertility awareness methods out there. So it does get a little hard because you can't treat them all the same because they're not all the same, right? So the one that I'm talking about specifically is called the symptothermal method. Sympto, meaning we're looking at cervical mucus as a primary fertile sign. Thermal, meaning we're looking at basal body temperature as our other fertile sign. Now, the beauty of having two fertile signs is that we can cross-check. So how this really matters is you want to know when can I open my fertile window and when can I close it. And one data point is great, but we like two because we like to double check, right? So with two separate pieces of information, we can understand very clearly and with a high level of accuracy, am I fertile or am I in my fertile window? So I love this graph, this figure, because it puts it all together. The fertile signs that we see, so the mucus and the temperature, are the direct visible result of what your reproductive hormones are doing. So you could go get an expensive hormone test, which is fine. I mean, the more data, the better. But you could also do it for free based on what your body's doing, right? So what you see and how you see it is how we can identify, do you have enough of these hormones at the right time? Has your fertile window opened? And has it closed? Using multiple biomarkers to cross-check. So just to quickly review, here we've got at the ovarian level, start of the cycle, the developing follicles, the one that gets ovulated, because they were making estrogen, these developing follicles. The rising estrogen was opening the cervix and fertile mucus was coming through. We ovulate. That corpus luteum, the thing that gets left behind, starts making progesterone. The progesterone makes your body temperature rise. And the progesterone also plugs and closes the cervix so you don't see fertile cervical mucus anymore. So it all goes together. This is what I'm saying. It's not like 17 different things to remember. It's like, okay, let me fall back on the biology of the menstrual cycle. What's it doing? And how does that explain what I'm seeing? So the vibe is not good, right? I like to just go on Google Images and I typed in fertility awareness and this came up, right? And this depicts so well how most people feel and see the fertility awareness method. And I'm very, as a scientist, very intrigued by this ranking system. Not so well, okay, really, really well. But similar to like we've been talking about this whole time, really, really well works, right? Because it's designed to completely shut down the reproductive system. Again, I'm not going to go too far into this. They don't understand this figure entirely, but here we can just see the general public view of a method like fertility awareness when stacked against other options for birth control. Even, I will say this real quick on withdrawal, because this I think is good biology to know. The withdrawal method in research is 96% effective, which is higher than most people think. And the reason it's that high to begin with is because a lot of people think, you can only get pregnant if there's sperm in the pre-cum, right? But pre-cum or pre-ejaculate comes from completely different anatomy part in the male reproductive system than sperm does. So theoretically, there should be zero sperm in pre-ejaculate, right? There have been a small degree of studies, very small, but still, it could be possible that some men do have sperm in the pre-ejaculate, which is like, okay, maybe then this method doesn't work so well, right? But in the research that I've seen, looking at the withdrawal method specifically, that was never a reason why the withdrawal method failed. In withdrawal method failure, it was simply because people weren't doing it correctly. They were pulling out too late or like not at all and claiming that they were using this method. Or, anytime there's ejaculate over like the genitals or like not washing your hands, there's a risk for contact pregnancy, which would be considered a failure of this method, right? But that, as you can see, is not necessarily the method failing itself. So this is why the information is so good. But anyway, I just put this in because I feel like this is how the general public sees it, but I wanted to explain it to you using actual, credible evidence and the biology behind these different methods. It's also really important to point out that there's a difference between method failure and user failure. So method failure would be like the condom breaking, or, worst case scenario, your IUD gets lodged and you get pregnant with the IUD, right? It does happen. That would be the method failure because there's nothing you can do as someone with an IUD to have caused that to fail. But when we get into something like the symptothermal method, it is 99% effective with perfect use, which puts it right up there with everything else we consider to be a gold standard method of birth control. However, because symptothermal method is entirely dependent on the user, this is why knowing the method and the rules of it is so important, because when we get to typical use, with the pill has a typical use rate of, or typical use efficacy of 93%. So the fact that symptothermal has a typical use rate of 93%, which is exact same as the pill, should put you a bit at ease that it's completely comparable to other methods you're already comfortable with using. Because we already know, it could be really easy to skip a day. So that's just why I like to point this out. It is entirely dependent on the user, but it's not that the method itself is a bad method. It's just that we need to be properly trained on how to use it. So when I say 99.4% effective for the symptothermal method, I'm pulling it from this study. So this study looked at 900 women and they untotal tracked 17,638 cycles over the course of the study. And this is where they got that really high efficacy rate from the women that were using the method correctly. They only had the 0.6 out of 100, so the 0.6% had an unintended pregnancy with perfect method use. So they had no unprotected intercourse during the identified fertile time. 1.8, so 1.8% of women had an unintended pregnancy with another method in the fertile time. Because this is also really important to point out. If you have a method like the symptothermal method that allows you to determine your fertile window, what you do in that fertile window is not the method, right? So if you're like, I know I'm in my fertile window, I'm going to use condoms. Now you're relying on this efficacy, right? You're not relying on the symptothermal method. You're relying on the condom efficacy. So really important to point that out. If you're relying on withdrawal during the fertile window, now you're relying on 96% efficacy. So these are like important when we talk about the efficacy of any method because it does depend on what you're actually doing, right? So how do we get a healthy menstrual cycle back? Here are the 6 parameters of a healthy cycle I wanted to share with you all today. So healthy cycle length, this is when you're transitioning off of birth control. These are the hallmarks you want to look for. Is your cycle between 24 and 35 days long and not varying more or less than 8 days per cycle? So it's super common that you can have, a 25-day cycle and then a 26-day cycle, a 23-day cycle, but not so common that you have a 22-day cycle and then a 38-day cycle. That would be a red flag. Menstruation length and quality. So your period should last around 3 to 7 days, starting out really heavy and decreasing to lighter over the course of the 3 to 7 days. It should be like a dark red wine, and the lighter flow should be bright red, pinkish, or brown. There shouldn't be any mid-cycle spotting or bleeding, and moderate to severe pain should be investigated further. I can't say this enough. If you have pain more than a 3 on a scale of 1 to 10, if you're taking more than 1 to 2 painkillers during your period, or if it feels worse than like a sore muscle after a workout, that is a red flag. It is absolutely worthy of investigation. It's very common, but it's not normal. And I wish someone had told me that when I was younger. For the pre-ovulatory phase, we want to look for clear signs of pending ovulation, and that would be your cervical mucus. It starts to show anytime between days 10 and 23, but it can start as early as day 5. So you would want to know your personal patterns before you start risking any unprotected sex in that pre-ovulatory phase. Like I said, it was relatively infertile. For your cervical mucus patterns, we want to see a pattern of non-peak to peak cervical mucus. I didn't explain the difference between those today, but I do in other places, and the method absolutely does as well. For ovulation, this will occur on the last day of peak cervical mucus, which is, you've probably heard of it like egg white. It's like clear and stretchy and lubricative, and you could like do this with it if you were to finger test it. That is optimal for conception cervical mucus. It's called peak. And then post-ovulatory, again, it needs to be a 12 to 14-day luteal phase before the start of the next cycle. This is to allow for healthy endometrial maturation. So that 12 to 14 days is what allows your uterine lining to get like really rich and full of nutrients and blood supply to support a fertilized egg and sustain a healthy pregnancy. So this is a little sneak peek of what the method looks like. This is my data. I have no problem sharing it. This is from 2 cycles ago. So if, I don't know, I don't think anyone here was on my last call, but I did share this and point out my own red flags. My red flags here, which we can discuss, is I had an 11-day luteal phase. So this was ovulation day. And like I said, optimal is between 12 and 14. So this was a little low. This is saying I didn't have quite enough progesterone to sustain the full life cycle of that corpus luteum, right? So we can understand what's happening biologically based on what we see in a chart. The other red flag was I still had, this is, don't worry about like any of this crazy shit, but like what this means is I was still seeing cervical mucus after ovulation. If you were to learn, I swear it like seems scary, but it gets a lot easier after you just learn it and do it a couple cycles. But what I'm seeing here, cervical mucus post-ovulation, that means the progesterone hadn't completely plugged up the cervix, right? I wasn't seeing completely dry days, which is what you would expect. So already 2 red flags for my last cycle. And then knowing this information, I was able to make some really clear adjustments. And this was my latest cycle, right? So we see this, the green is no cervical mucus at all. So we see I didn't see any cervical mucus at the late luteal phase, and my luteal phase was back to 12 days long. So I talk about fertility awareness being like such a great option if you're looking for hormone-free birth control because it's so effective at 99.4%. Like that in itself is a selling point. But what I really like about it is the ability to do this, right? It's like you get a report card every month for your health. We can understand how your thyroid's doing based on temperature. We can understand if you have an increased risk for cervical cancer based on if you're showing signs of cervical dysplasia through your cervical mucus. We can understand if there's an infection. We can understand, if there's a hormonal imbalance. And then we have very specific protocols that we can do to remedy those things, like you saw me do between January and February, which was amazing. So, oh yeah, I think I yelled. I always do this and then forget I do this. Fertility awareness is not just effective birth control. So, like I just said, even though it is, it's a real-time health diagnostic tool. You will get much better insight just by paying a little more attention to what comes out of your body on a day-to-day basis than you would in a doctor's appointment. And we're not too dumb. I remember thinking like because I was on, not one, but two different forms of birth control, like I don't trust myself to handle this, right? And I think that's a conditioning that we have to undo because you are. Like everyone here is perfectly capable of doing it once you're given the tools how. So not only can you actually have control over your fertile window and know exactly when you're fertile and when you're not, you can then in real time adjust what you're seeing to make your whole body, right? Because not just your reproductive system, but your whole body as healthy as possible. So this is a question I get a lot too, and I wanted to address it because I got a little time. What about natural cycles or other devices and apps? And it's a really good question, right? So I'm gonna get on my soapbox and tell you what I think. I use natural cycles and I have the Aura connection, but I don't rely on it, right? Because I see it as a convenience thing. I don't put my full trust in it. Why? Because the natural cycles itself, so let's talk about that first, is not symptothermal. It's temperature only and it's not even the fertile sign I talk about here is basal body temperature, right? Typically you test that orally under the arm. Some people do it vaginally, but it's core basal body temperature. If you have the Aura connection and you're not using the natural cycles thermometer, this is actually skin temperature change. And they're using an algorithm to transform it to a body temperature, right? So that's already kind of adjacent to a fertile sign. But it's using your temperature and then putting it through a predictive algorithm and giving you a fertile yes or no day, right? But the whole nature of a predictive algorithm is that it's using past data to predict your current and future cycles. And that by definition is not symptothermal. That by definition is rhythm method. So, I mean, the confidence already starts to waver. I don't think they do a bad job with the algorithm. I've compared mine with like my own observations and then what the app tells me. And it deviates a bit, but I never saw a situation where it would have like led me very astray. But I haven't looked at every combination, right? And that's just me. I'm an N of one. What about everyone else? Like I don't know that for sure. Right. And it doesn't allow you to input like, oh, I saw cervical mucus today, like call me fertile. So that's consideration number one. Other apps like the Flow app, when people come to me and they have, their fertile window calculated, I have to wonder because it's not taking any fertile sign input, right? It's based entirely on a predictive algorithm. So already there, if we're not taking cervical mucus into account and we're not adapting for inputs, it's really not satisfying the real-time fertile sign of piece of the equation, which is the whole thing. That's the whole thing we're looking at here. There's also the cost factor. So I'm not actually sure what everything costs, but for me, the Aura was a lot of money, and then you pay an additional $100, hundred something dollars for the natural cycle subscription. Like there's a cost factor there too. And you can do it for free with, well, I think the app I use, okay, this app, I'll be completely honest, it's like $2.60 a month. So, okay, it's not entirely free. But I could do it with pen and paper. Do you know what I'm saying? But I enjoy using the app because it makes my life easier. And then the devices kind of make you still feel like you needed birth control to avoid pregnancy. And now you need these devices still to either target conception or still avoid your fertile window. And I want to challenge that because I believe that we all can handle it. And the beautiful thing about it is I know we're in like biblical times, but no matter what happens, like from a government perspective or a natural disaster perspective, like what I like so much about this method is that no one can take it away, right? No matter what happens, you always have it. And even if you're not charting to this extent, like it does become habitual to understand like this, the way we check cervical mucus is through an external wipe. So you don't even have to like go fishing for anything, right? You just have to learn how to wipe, check, see what's on the toilet paper, and then learn this standardized notation system. That's all it is. It takes 5 extra seconds out of your day, right? So It's just understanding the method, learning how to use it, and then knowing that, yeah, it's entirely possible for you to be able to do this. And we just need to be given the information how. So, with that, I will say thank you all so much for coming and for listening. No one had any questions, which I I don't know. If you have them, please ask. If not, you have my email. Please do reach out. I can talk about this stuff all day, so please do. I'll stick around for maybe like a minute or two, but other than that, if no one has questions, thank you guys so much. I really appreciate your time. I know you could have been doing a lot of stuff in this hour, so I I love that you are all here. Thank you. Thank you guys for coming. Awesome.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye guys. I'll see you later.